A long time before Madeline was to know it, Claudia had ceased crying and sat still as a statue on Madeline's lap, her liquid eyes fixed on me, oblivious to the soft red hair that fell around her or the woman's hand that still stroked her. And I sat slumped against the bedpost, staring back at those vampire eyes, unable and unwilling to speak in my defense. Madeline was whispering into Claudia's ear. She was letting her tears fall into Claudia's tresses. And then gently, Claudia said to her, "Leave us." "No." She shook her head, holding tight to Claudia, and then she shut her eyes and trembled all over with some terrible vexation, some awful torment. But Claudia was leading her from the chair, and she was now pliant and shocked and white-faced, the green taffeta ballooning around the small yellow silk dress. In the archway of the parlour they stopped, and Madeline stood as if confused, her hand at her throat, beating like a wing, then going still. She looked about her like that hapless victim on the stage of the Theatre des Vampires, who did not know where she was. But Claudia had gone for something, and I saw her emerge from the shadows with what appeared to be a large doll. I rose on my knees to look at it. It was a doll, the doll of a little girl with raven hair and green eyes, adorned with lace and ribbons, sweet-faced and wide eyes, its porcelain feet tinkling as Claudia put it into Madeline's arms. And Madeline's eyes appeared to harden as she held the doll, and her lips drew back from her teeth in a grimace as she stroked its hair. She was laughing low under her breath. "Lie down," Claudia said to her, and together they appeared to sink into the cushions of the couch, the green taffeta rustling and giving way as Claudia lay with her and put her arms around her neck. I saw the doll sliding, dropping to the floor, yet Madeline's hand groped for it and held it dangling, her own head thrown back, her eyes shut tight, and Claudia's curls stroking her face. I settled back on the floor and leaned against the soft siding of the bed. Claudia was speaking now in a low voice, barely above a whisper, telling Madeline to be patient, to be still. I dreaded the sound of her step on the carpet, the sound of the door sliding closed to shut Madeline away from us, and the hatred that lay between us like a killing vapor. But then I looked up to her. Claudia was standing there as if transfixed and lost in thought, all rancor and bitterness gone from her face, so that she had the blank expression of that doll. "All you've said to me is true," I said to her. "I deserve your hatred. I've deserved it from those first moments when Lestat put you in my arms." She seemed unaware of me, and her eyes were infused with a soft light. Her beauty burned into my soul so that I could hardly stand it. And then she said, wondering, "You could have killed me then, despite him. You could have done it." Then her eyes rested on me calmly. "Do you wish to do it now?" "Do it now?" I put my arm around her, moved her close to me, warmed by her softened voice. "Are you mad to say such things to me? Do I want to do it now?" "I want you to do it," she said. "Bend down now as you did then. Draw the blood out of me drop by drop. All you have the strength for. Push my heart to the brink. I am small. You can take me. I won't resist you. I am something frail. You can crush like a flower." "You mean these things? You mean what you say to me?" I asked. "Why don't you place the knife here? Why don't you turn it?" "Would you die with me?" she asked, with a sly, mocking smile. "Would you, in fact, die with me?" She pressed. "Don't you understand what is happening to me? That he's killing me, that master vampire who has you in thrall, that he won't share your love with me, not a drop of it. I see his power in your eyes. I see your misery, your distress, the love for him you can't hide. Turn around. I'll make you look at me with those eyes that want him. I'll make you listen. Don't any more. Don't. I won't leave you. I've sworn to you, don't you see it? I cannot give you to that woman. But I'm fighting for my life. Give her to me so she can care for me. Complete the guise I must have to live. And he can have you then. I am fighting for my life. I all but shoved her off. No, it's madness, it's witchery, I said, trying to defy her. It's you who will not share me with him. It's you who want every drop of that love. If not from me, from her. He overpowers you, he disregards you. And it's you who wish him dead, the way you killed Lestat. Well, you won't make me party to his death. I tell you, not this death. I will not make her one of us. I will not damn the legions of mortals who'll die at her hands if I do. Your power over me is broken. I will not. Oh, if she could only have understood. Not for a moment could I truly believe her words against Armand. That out of that detachment which was beyond revenge, he could selfishly wish for her death. But that was nothing to me now. Something far more terrible than I could grasp was happening. Something that I was only beginning to understand, against which my anger was nothing but a mockery, a hollow attempt to oppose her tenacious will. She hated me. She loathed me, as she herself had confessed, and my heart shriveled inside me, as if, in depriving me of that love which had sustained me a lifetime, she had dealt me a mortal blow. The knife was there. I was dying for her, dying for that love, as I was that very night when Lestat gave her to me, turned her eyes to me, and told her my name. That love which had warmed me in my self-hatred, allowed me to exist. Oh, how Lestat had understood it, and now at last his plan was undone. But it went beyond that. In some region from which I was shrinking as I strode back and forth, my hands opening and closing at my sides, feeling not only that hatred in her liquid eyes. It was her pain. She had shown me her pain. To give me immortality in this hopeless guise, this helpless form. I put my hands to my ears, as if she spoke the words yet, and the tears flowed. For all these years I had depended utterly upon her cruelty, her absolute lack of pain. And pain was what she showed to me, undeniable pain. Oh, how Lestat would have laughed at us. That was why she had put the knife to him, because he would have laughed. To destroy me utterly, she need only show me that pain. The child I made a vampire suffered. Her agony was as my own. There was a coffin in that other room, a bed for Madeleine, to which Claudia retreated to leave me alone with what I could not abide. I welcomed the silence, and sometime during the few hours that remained of the night I found myself at the open window, feeling the slow mist of the rain. It glistened on the fronds of the ferns, on sweet white flowers that listed, bowed, and finally broke from their stems. A carpet of flowers littering the little balcony, the petals pounded softly by the rain. I felt weak now, and utterly alone. What had passed between us tonight could never be undone, and what had been done to Claudia by me could never be undone. But I was somehow, to my own bewilderment, empty of all regret. Perhaps it was the night, the starless sky, the gas lamps frozen in the mist that gave some strange comfort, for which I never asked and didn't know how, in this emptiness and aloneness, to receive. I am alone, I was thinking. I am alone. It seemed just, perfectly, and so to have a pleasing, inevitable form. And I pictured myself then forever alone, as if on gaining that vampire strength the night of my death, I had left Lestat and never looked back for him. as if I had moved on away from him, beyond the need of him and anyone else, as if the night had said to me, "You are the night, and the night alone understands you and unfolds you in its arms, one with the shadows, without nightmare, an inexplicable peace." Yet I could feel the end of this peace as surely as I'd felt my brief surrender to it, and it was breaking like the dark clouds. The urgent pain of Claudia's loss pressed in on me, behind me, like a shape gathered from the corners of this cluttered and oddly alien room. But outside, even as the night seemed to dissolve in a fierce driving wind, I could feel something calling to me, something inanimate which I'd never known. And a power within me seemed to answer that power, not with resistance, but with an inscrutable, chilling strength. I moved silently through the rooms, gently dividing the doors until I saw, in the dim light cast by the flickering gas flames behind me, that sleeping woman lying in my shadow on the couch, the doll limp against her breast. Some time before I knelt at her side, I saw her eyes open, and I could feel beyond her in the collected dark those other eyes watching me, that breathless, tiny vampire face waiting. "Will you care for her, Madeline?" I saw her hands clutch at the doll, turning its face against her breast, and my own hand went out for it, though I did not know why, even as she was answering me. "Yes," she repeated it again desperately. "Is this what you believe her to be? A doll?" I asked her, my hand closing on the doll's head, only to feel her snatch it away from me, see her teeth clenched as she glared at me. "A child who won't die. That's what she is," she said, as if she were pronouncing a curse. "Ah," I whispered. "I've done with dolls," she said, shoving it away from her into the cushions of the couch. She was fumbling with something on her breast, something she wanted me to see, something she wanted me not to see, her fingers catching hold of it and closing over it. I knew what it was, had noticed it before, a locket fixed with a gold pin. I wish I could describe the passion that had infected her round features, how soft her baby mouth was distorted. "And the child who did die?" I guessed, watching her. I was picturing the doll shop, dolls with the same face. She shook her head, her hand pulling hard on the locket so that the pin ripped the taffeta. It was fear I saw in her now, a consuming panic, and her hand bled as she opened it from the broken pin. I took the locket from her fingers. "My daughter," she whispered, her lip trembling. It was a doll's face on the small fragment of porcelain. Claudia's face, a baby face, a saccharine sweet mockery of innocence an artist had painted there, a child with raven hair, like the doll, and the mother, terrified, was staring at the darkness in front of her. "Grief," I said gently. "I've done with grief," she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at me. "If you know how I long to have your power, I'm ready for it. I hunger for it." And she turned to me, breathing deeply, so that her breast seemed to swell under her dress. A violent frustration rent her face then. She turned away from me, shaking her head, her curls. "If you were a mortal man, man and monster," she said angrily. "If I could only show you my power." And she smiled malignantly, defiantly at me. "I could make you want me, desire me. But you're unnatural." Her mouth went down at the corners. "What can I give you? What can I do to make you give me what you have?" Her hand hovered over her breasts, seeming to caress them like a man's hand. It was strange, that moment. Strange because I could never have predicted the feeling her words incited in me. The way that I saw her now with that small, enticing waist, saw the round, plump curve of her breasts, and those delicate, pouting lips. She never seemed what the mortal man in me was. She never dreamed what the mortal man in me was. How tormented I was by the blood I'd only just drunk. Desire her I did, more than she knew, because she didn't understand the nature of the kill. And with a man's pride I wanted to prove that to her, to humiliate her for what she had said to me, for the cheap vanity of her provocation and the eyes that had looked away from me now in disgust. But this was madness. These were not the reasons to grant eternal life. And cruelly, surely, I said to her, "Did you love this child?" I will never forget her face then, the violence in her, the absolute hatred. "Yes!" She all but hissed the words at me. "How dare you?" She reached for the locket even as I clutched it. It was guilt that was consuming her, not love. It was guilt. That shop of dolls Claudia had described to me, shelves and shelves of the effigy of that dead child. But guilt that absolutely understood the finality of death. There was something as hard in her as the evil in myself, something as powerful. She had her hand out towards me. She touched my waistcoat and opened her fingers there, pressing them against my chest. And I was on my knees, drawing close to her, her hair brushing my face. "Hold fast to me when I take you," I said to her, seeing her eyes grow wide, her mouth open. "And when the swoon is strongest, listen all the harder for the beating of my heart. Hold and say over and over, 'I will live.'" "Yes, yes," she was nodding, her heart pounding with her excitement. Her hands burned on my neck, fingers forcing their way into my collar. "Look beyond me at that distant light. Don't take your eyes off it, not for a second, and say over and over, 'I will live.'" She gasped as I broke the flesh, the warm current coming into me. Her breasts crushed against me, her body arching up, helpless from the couch. And I could see her eyes even as I shut my own, see that taunting, provocative mouth. I was drawing on her, hard, lifting her, and I could feel her weakening, her hands dropping limp at her sides. "Tight, tight," I whispered over the hot stream of her blood, her heart thundering in my ears, her blood swelling my satiated veins. "The lamp," I whispered. "Look at it." Her heart was slowing, stopping, and her head dropped back from me on the velvet, her eyes dull to the point of death. It seemed for a moment I couldn't move, yet I knew I had to, that someone else was lifting my wrist to my mouth, as the room turned round and round, that I was focusing on that light as I had told her to do. As I tasted my own blood from my own wrist, and then forced it into her mouth. "Drink it. Drink," I said to her, but she lay as if dead. I gathered her close to me, the blood pouring over her lips. Then she opened her eyes, and I felt the gentle pressure of her mouth, and then her hands closing tight on the arm as she began to suck. I was rocking her, whispering to her, trying desperately to break my swoon, and then I felt her powerful pull. Every blood vessel felt it. I was threaded through and through with her pulling, my hand holding fast to the couch now, her heart beating fierce against my heart, her fingers digging deep into my arm, my outstretched palm. It was cutting me, scoring me, so I all but cried out as it went on, and I was backing away from her, yet pulling her with me, my life passing through my arm, her moaning breath in time with her pulling. And those strings which were my veins, those searing wires pulled at my very heart, harder and harder, until, without will or direction, I had wrenched free of her and fallen away from her, clutching that bleeding wrist tight with my own hand. She was staring at me, the blood staining her open mouth. An eternity seemed to pass as she stared. She doubled and tripled in my blurred vision, then collapsed into one trembling shape. Her hand moved to her mouth, yet her eyes did not move but grew large in her face as she stared. And then she rose slowly, not as if by her own power, but as if lifted from the couch bodily by some invisible force which held her now, staring as she turned round and round, her massive skirt moving stiff as if she were all of one piece, turning like some great carved ornament on a music box that dances helplessly round and round to the music. And suddenly she was staring down at the taffeta, grabbing hold of it, pressing it between her fingers so it zinged and rustled, and she let it fall, quickly covering her ears, her eyes shut tight, then opened wide again. And then it seemed she saw the lamp, the distant low gas lamp of the other room that gave a fragile light through the double doors, and she ran to it and stood beside it, watching as if it were alive. "Don't touch it," Claudia said to her, and gently guided her away. But Madeline had seen the flowers on the balcony, and she was drawing close to them now, her outstretched palms brushing the petals and then pressing the droplets of rain to her face. I was hovering on the fringes of the room, watching her every move, how she took the flowers and crushed them in her hands and let the petals fall all around her, and how she pressed her fingertips to the mirror and stared into her own eyes. My own pain had ceased. A handkerchief bound the wound, and I was waiting, seeing now that Claudia had no knowledge from memory of what was to come next. They were dancing together, as Madeline's skin grew paler and paler in the unsteady golden light. She scooped Claudia into her arms, and Claudia rode round in circles with her, her own small face alert and wary behind her smile. And then Madeline weakened. She stepped backwards and seemed to lose her balance, but quickly she righted herself and let Claudia go gently down to the ground on tiptoe. Claudia embraced her. "Louis," she signaled to me under her breath. "Louis." I beckoned for her to come away, and Madeline, not seeming even to us, was staring at her outstretched hands. Her face was blanched and drawn, and suddenly she was scratching at her lips and staring at the dark stains on her fingertips. No, I cautioned her gently, taking Claudia's hand and holding her close to my side. A long moan escaped Madeline's lips. "Louis," Claudia whispered in that preternatural voice which Madeline could not hear. "She is dying, but your child's mind can't remember. You were spared it. It left no mark on you," I whispered to her, brushing the hair back from her ear, my eyes never leaving Madeline, who was wandering from mirror to mirror, the tears flowing freely now, the body giving up its life. "But Louis, if she dies," Claudia cried. "No," I knelt down, seeing the distress in her small face. "The blood was strong enough. She will live, but she will be afraid, terribly afraid." And gently, firmly, I pressed Claudia's hand and kissed her cheek. She looked at me then with mingled wonder and fear, and she watched me with that same expression as I wandered closer to Madeline, drawn by her cries. She reeled now, her hands out, and I caught her and held her close. Her eyes already burned with unnatural light, a violet fire reflected in her tears. "It's mortal death. Only mortal death," I said to her gently. "Do you see the sky? We must leave it now, and you must hold tight to me. Lie by my side. A sleep as heavy as death will come over my limbs, and I won't be able to solace you. And you will lie there, and you will struggle with it. But you hold tight to me in the darkness. Do you hear? You hold tight to my hands, which will hold your hands as long as I have feeling." She seemed lost for the moment in my gaze, and I sensed the wonder that surrounded her, how the radiance of my eyes was the radiance of all colors, and how all those colors were all the more reflected for her in my eyes. I guided her gently to the coffin, telling her again not to be afraid. "When you arise, you will be immortal," I said. "No natural cause of death can harm you. Come, lie down." I could see her fear of it, see her shrink from the narrow box, its satin no comfort. Already her skin began to glisten, to have that brilliance that Claudia and I shared. I knew now she would not surrender until I lay with her. I held her and looked across the long vista of the room, to where Claudia stood with that strange coffin watching me. Her eyes were still but dark with an undefined suspicion, a cool distrust. I set Madeline down beside her bed and moved towards those eyes, and, kneeling calmly beside her, I gathered Claudia in my arms. "Don't you recognize me?" I asked her. "Don't you know who I am?" She looked at me. "No," she said. I smiled. I nodded. "Bear me no ill will," I said. "We are even." At that she moved her head to one side and studied me carefully, then seemed to smile despite herself and to nod in assent. "For you see," I said to her in that same calm voice, "what died tonight in this room was not that woman. It will take her many nights to die, perhaps years. What has died in this room tonight is the last vestige in me of what was human." A shadow fell over her face, clear, as if the composure were rent like a veil, and her lips parted, but only with a short intake of breath. Then she said, "Well, then you are right indeed. We are even." And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Okay, so that's another section of Interview with the Vampire. What are some of the cool things we have to talk about today? The first thing I have noted down here is at the very beginning, and it's where I talked about at the very end yesterday, the sort of notion of Louis kind of going back and forth on his delusion of Claudia loving him just as much as she hates him, and his kind of tangential belief in that. And it appears that very quickly after he's kind of trying to comfort himself with this notion, his delusion breaks, and he realizes that Claudia does just hate him as fully and completely as she may suggest. And the thing that I really want to note in this regard is that his justification for her hatred is odd and kind of deflective. When he talks about her being right to hate him, he says that she was right to hate him from the moment Lestat put her into my arms, which, from the way I'm reading it, sounds like not a full acceptance of his responsibility. It sounds like he's trying to deflect most of the blame onto Lestat in this regard, and not fully acknowledge the pivotal role he played in doing this to her. He's not really willing, he's not fully accepting here that this was his fault. That, yes, Lestat also did a bad thing here, but that he is as responsible, that he is also responsible for killing a child, essentially. Lestat made her into a vampire, but Louis still killed her, essentially, is the point I'm trying to get across here. She has every right to hate him for that, just as much as she has right to hate him for the vampire bit. And after he kind of comes to this conclusion and accepts that, she hates him, and I suppose claims to have broken free from the control of Claudia, he acts as though he is free of all control and manipulation. He pretends that he is truly independent, going through the night alone. And this just sort of plays into the fact that we know that's not true. We know he's lying to himself, as he always does, and that he is clearly attached to Armand in a very dependent and obsessive way, as he has become over and over again. And he's deluded himself, I think, into believing that Armand is somehow different. That this time Armand, his relationship with Armand is going to be so much different than his relationship with Lestat or Claudia. Because Armand is so wonderful and different. And he never really justifies this beyond just claiming Armand's different. I mean, he apparently will not hold information back from him. And his sense of that is based entirely off of how Armand looks. And And there's no notion of Armand treating him in any different way. So he's still as dependent and, just not free. But he's now claiming that he is. And even worse, he a bit later on, he does this thing where he talks about, how he can't bring this vampire into existence. He already feels tormented about the painter that he's killed and all the other mortals that I've killed. And he says this, and he keeps doing this. He keeps talking about how tormented he feels and whining about how horrible everything is. But he keeps doing bad things. And in truth, Louis needs to shut up about how tormented he feels if he's going to keep doing these bad things. He can't complain that he feels so bad about all the bad things he's done, and then the second he leaves Armand's sanctuary, he goes out and kills the first painter he meets, first person that practically talks to him. Louis is a hypocrite. He is convincing himself he's doing nothing wrong. He is fully convinced of his own victimization and moral superiority, I suppose. He has this victim complex that is also a superiority complex, is, I guess, a way of getting close to describing it. Now, another thing that I have noted down here is obviously the main crux of this scene revolves around the turning of Madeleine into a vampire. And one of the interesting things about Madeleine is the fact that Madeleine actively desires vampirism. She's kind of a vampiric servant figure that Claudia appears to have been fostering in her spare time. She owns a doll shop that Claudia appears to have frequented. With her frequent, acquisition of various dolls. I believe it's very strongly implied she's the doll maker that made her the lady doll earlier in the story. And this is the intention being that Madeleine can become this immortal mother for Claudia. Because Madeleine lost her own child just as Claudia lost her mother so many years ago. And in this, Madeleine could become an immortal mother figure and fulfill her desire for her lost child, as Claudia also desires her lost mother, as we've seen when Claudia refused to feed off a woman that looked like her mother in the past. And so there's this fulfillment to be found, but there's also this notion of Claudia gaining a literal protector figure here. So there's two ways to look at it, and I think both are relatively valid. The first is that Claudia might see this person desiring a child to protect and consider her a very valuable, victim / easily manipulated individual who will be able to protect her just as Louis and Lestat have served as protectors for her in the past. And then there's another way of looking at it where we see Claudia very genuinely desiring this mother figure that she was never capable of having, and that it's just a good side effect that vampiric mother would then be able to look after her in much the same way that Louis and Lestat did. I'm inclined to believe it's a combination of the two. I think that Claudia definitely has a desire for this mother figure, but I also think she very tangibly recognizes the need for a defender in a world that she cannot operate in because of her childlike form. She just can't do so many of the things that she's reliant upon Louis to do. Like, she can't book a hotel, she can't travel freely, that kind of thing. There's some interesting potential parallels to Rice's own life in this notion. We've talked about those a little bit before relating to the character of Claudia, but I think this is a really interesting one because you see this desire for an immortal mother and child pairing, this desire to remain static in this parental state. And I suppose interestingly here is that where all the other vampire relationships are defined in very sexual terms, this is a relationship that is defined in a platonic parental term. I'm sure there's a better word for it there, but it's not a sexual dynamic between them. It is very, very explicitly a parental dynamic between them. And I think there's potentially parallels to Rice's own loss of child and this desire to maintain in static parenthood that we could suggest within it, and almost a degree of coping with that, and and a final resolution on that subject that we will get to as it arrives in the story. We're not quite there yet. Some other interesting things to talk about the character of Madeline, back to that, is that when Louis initially denies her the vampiric condition, her immediate instinct is to attempt to use her sexuality to win over Louis, or at least she comments that she wishes she could use that sexuality. If Louis were a mortal man, she would know what to do, is the implication. And that's a really interesting thing, because it relates to this kind of gender dynamic and these sexual power dynamics that is running core throughout this novel, where women are very frequently used as communication objects, sexual objects, literal like food, by the male vampires dominating the text. And when she says this to Louis makes this very strange remark where he essentially comments that his desire to feed is growing on her in a desire to prove a point, effectively. And this creates this essential like reflection on Louis's own desire for patriarchal domination. This notion that Louis wants to put her in her place. He clearly has a lesser view of her in this regard. And ironically, he sounds critical of her when he accuses her of thinking Claudia to be a doll, even though that's essentially exactly what he does. He seems worried that she will view her as an object to be possessed, even though he views her as an object to be possessed himself. And obviously, when he does feed on her, that feeding is metaphorical for sexual domination. The sexual implications I've covered 100 times in this reading of vampiric feeding in this text. But this, the fact that he comments that he should feed on her to prove a point is very pressing when we consider that feeding is a metaphor for sexual domination in this regard, where effectively he needs to exert sexual power over her in order to put her in her place and assert his own control. And it's also further fitting and highlights the role of women within this text, where Claudia, as a female character, needs the male Louis in order to actually turn Madeline. Claudia cannot bring characters into vampirism herself. She needs Louis to do that for her. And the reason that Claudia cannot do this is because of the intentional stunting of Claudia's sexual development and sexual fulfillment that was caused by her own male domination at the hands of Louis and Lestat. Obviously, it's not an overarching commentary on the nature of female vampirism, because a fully grown female vampire would be able to do that fine. My point here is that it is metaphorically reflective of how these characters are treated within the text, where they time and time again are rendered subservient and impotent in the face of the domineering, controlling, patriarchal male vampires, who are most definitely running the show. And I think that's the case throughout Interview. In the sequels, Anne Rice does kind of a 180 on this. And one of the relatively interesting commentaries that she does in Queen of the Damned relates to Lestat embodying this kind of patriarchal influence as something to be loathed. The way she talks about Lestat after this novel, I don't really get behind. I think there's a lot of Lestat worshipping going on in the sequels that I think aren't really helpful. But that's at least an interesting thing to consider. And then finally, I guess one of the things to talk about here is that once Louis turns Madeline into a vampire, he feeds her his blood, he then makes her sleep in his coffin, just as he was made to sleep in Lestat's coffin following his creation. And this kind of manifests the closing of this cycle of abuse. The cycle of abuse is complete. Louis had Lestat abuse him, and Louis has then gone on to abuse others. He is replicating this behavior that was done onto him, and he is asserting his control in a way that he once had denied from him by having power stripped from him by Lestat. So that's interesting to consider. And with this turning of Madeleine and Louis's creation of his own vampiric child, this time in the metaphorical sense as opposed to the literal, Louis has lost his humanity. Not by any nature. There is nothing forcing him to have done any of these things, but through his own choices. He makes this comment, this very wonderful line where he talks about, in this room tonight, the thing that has died was the last part of me that was human. Obviously, first thing being completely discounting the oncoming death of Madeleine, sort of pushing it to the side, not really caring about it, returning to good old-fashioned, self-centered, narcissistic Louis. But even this comment, the last part of me that was human, this whole shtick, it represents a manifestation of him buying into his own bullshit. Louis fully believes in this moment that he is irredeemable. The death spiral is complete, and as such, he does not bother to attempt at redemption. He fully believes himself irredeemable. He believes himself evil. He believes there is no escape from his condition, even though there is nothing, and I cannot stress this enough, nothing forcing him to be the monster that he is. And that, I think, is one of the profound themes to consider regarding this novel. It is one of the ones that isn't, I think, perhaps as immediately talked about, but it's very, very relevant and something that has to be gone over and over again, because nothing is making these vampires act evil. No god, no devil. It means you're responsible for your own actions. It doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. In this moment, Louis has become a monster. He has become a vampire in the cultural monstrosity sense. He has become just like Lestat, to the point where he directly mirrors Lestat's actions in order to prove something to himself, perhaps, but at the very least mimic them in his attempt at manufacturing control and dominating other living beings. That's Louis. That's Louis's main character arc. There's more development to come. We'll see if there's any hope for Louis as the story continues. But it's just worth considering. He's got so close, but in the end it didn't matter. He bought back into his own bullshit. He bought back into his own lies, and nihilism claimed him. So yeah, that is another little section of analysis. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be back again tomorrow with some more of Interview with the Vampire, so I'll see you then.